I feel like my whole brain is a tinfoil hat right now.
Just crinkling away.
It's making all the aluminum sounds.
Bouncing all those space lasers off of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels great. It'll never flatten out again, just like real tinfoil.
We're ready for sound politics. Welcome to Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Cat Smith in for Scott Greenstone today. And we are going to talk about the fall of Joe Kent.
Yeah, so he is a local Washington military veteran and multi-time congressional candidate who went to work under the Trump administration in D.C., but this week he crashed out.
Big time.
And he says it's all over his stance to oppose the U.S. and Israel war on Iran.
And Kent resigned on Tuesday as director of the National Counterterrorism Center. That's a position Trump picked him for last year. And according to new reporting, Kent is under investigation for allegedly leaking classified information. The FBI has reportedly been looking into the matter since before he quit his job.
Earlier this week, when Joe Kent posted his resignation letter online, he said he was quitting because he believed Iran posed no imminent threat to the U.S. He also claimed that Israel had basically hoodwinked President Trump and pressured the U.S. into going to war.
Yeah, and this set off a firestorm in D.C. The White House said Kent's claims about the war are false. Other critics are accusing him of anti-Semitism. Trump, when asked about Kent's resignation, said good riddance to bad garbage.
But when I read his statement, I realized that it's a good thing that he's out, because he said that Iran was not a threat. Iran was a threat. Every country realized what a threat Iran was. The question is whether or not they wanted to do something about it.
And so Kent's announcement is the highest profile resignation from the Trump administration since the start of this war.
Yeah.
Libby, what should people here in the Pacific Northwest remember about Joe Kent?
Sure. So he is a former Green Beret. He deployed 11 times to combat zones. He lost his wife, a Navy cryptologist, when she was killed in a suicide bombing in Syria. And Joe Kent ran to the right of a moderate Republican congresswoman in the 3rd District in Southwest Washington. He defeated her in the primary in 2022, but then he lost in the general to Democrat Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez in what was considered a big upset for a Trump congressional district, a district that had voted for Trump. And then Joe Kent ran again in 2024 and lost again to Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez. And this is really important. Kent is a conspiracy theorist with a very large following on X.
Yeah, and during his first campaign that you just talked about, Kent came under fire for his ties to white nationalists. And he later tried to back away from those ties, saying that he opposes all racism and bigotry.
So last night, Wednesday night, Kent sits down with Tucker Carlson on Carlson's show. And this is one of those podcast interviews that goes on and on. It's almost 2 hours long. And they are discussing his decision to leave the administration. You know, this is the first time we're hearing Kent speaking about this, you know, beyond what he said in the letter. Tucker Carlson, of course, is probably the highest profile critic of this war among conservative
the most
media
vocal
ecosystem people. Most vocal. And, you know, Kent decides to go on this very popular right-wing show in order to make his case.
Yeah. And, you know, the two of them, they, like you said, it was almost 2 hours. They end up having this freewheeling discussion about conspiracy theories, who killed Charlie Kirk, what's in the JFK files, but they did spend a lot of time critiquing the Iran war, too.
Yeah, that was the way that the interview kicked off. It was a little bit more serious, and then it gets more loose as it goes.
Yes.
So you and I watched this yesterday afternoon.
Oh, did we?
We really did. We've had Joe Kent on KUOW in the past.
Yep.
So I had some expectations about what to look out for going into this. But, you know, again, this was kind of the biggest, longest, most wide-ranging interview with Kent that we've seen in a long time.
Yeah. So let's talk about what you and I learned, what we heard and saw in that interview yesterday, and how seriously can we take somebody who makes these huge conspiratorial claims without providing evidence, and what does Kent's resignation mean about the MAGA coalition right now?
We'll get into all of it after a quick break. And we're back with Sound Politics. I'm Libby Denkmann here with KUOW Politics editor Cat Smith.
Yep, and today we are talking about Joe Kent, and I want to be pretty clear about Joe Kent, right up front. This is a person who was accused Dr. Anthony Fauci of murder. He said that the 2020 election was stolen. Kent is a known peddler of conspiracy theories. And in his Senate confirmation hearings last year for his counterterrorism job, he didn't exactly disavow his election fraud statements or his belief that the January 6th riot was started by federal agents. Tinfoil hat stuff is part of Kent's brand.
Right. And the interview with Tucker Carlson really did veer into conspiracy theory territory in the second hour. And I'm listening and thinking, okay, for the first 60 minutes or so, this is relatively sober stuff.
Surprisingly so, yeah.
Very serious claims about a lack of imminent threat from Iran, a lack of information flowing to the president. And then we get to Kent suggesting that Butler, Pennsylvania, the assassination attempt against Trump, was an inside Secret Service op orchestrated by Israel. And in my brain, I'm going ding, 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 because this is the Joe Kent that I know from when he campaigned here in Washington state. He was also echoing these very wacky online theories about the Charlie Kirk assassination. He is walking this line in the conversation with Tucker Carlson where he's saying, I have worked with Israel. I do not hate Israel. They are good at what they do. But then he peddles tropes about their nefarious influence on all kinds of world events that are really classic anti-Semitic stuff. Mm-hmm. The fascinating thing to me about this was how Joe Kent wove together a total devotion to Trump in talking with Carlson with criticisms of the war. And he sort of used Israel as this boogeyman who was able to fool Trump. And that absolved Trump of responsibility for starting a war in the Middle East, which he had promised to do, which his supporters believed was one of his primary campaign promises.
So that's a good overview of what we saw. Let's start to drill down into some of the topics that they covered in this wide-ranging interview. So, okay, for the past year, Joe Kent is heading up the intelligence office that's responsible for assessing foreign and domestic terrorism threats, and it's coordinating strategy across agencies like the FBI, the CIA, and others. And it seems like in the year that he was in this job, he did not have a great experience.
Yeah, so Joe Kent told Tucker Carlson that he wanted to use government resources to investigate conspiracy theories, and he was frustrated that he couldn't. He claimed that the FBI blocked his office from looking into the Charlie Kirk assassination.
The National Counterterrorism Center's mandate is to investigate any foreign ties, to see if there's potentially any foreign ties. If we don't find any foreign ties, we back off. What I'm saying, without getting into too much detail, is there was more for us to investigate.
You believe there was reason to investigate foreign ties to Charlie Kirk's murder and were told by the FBI, DOJ?
FBI and DOJ, yeah.
No, you're not allowed to investigate that.
Stop. It's done. They basically cut off our access to be able to get into that information. And look, I didn't even say necessarily that I believe there's 100% foreign ties. There were data points that we needed to investigate.
Okay, so he doesn't talk about what data points he's talking about, but I cannot overstate how wacky this line of theorizing has gotten in very popular online spaces on the right.
Yeah.
Candace Owens, an extremely popular conservative host, she has a multi-part series that, claims that Charlie Kirk's widow, Erica, was somehow an Israeli sleeper cell agent and involved in, undermining Charlie and ultimately having him murdered. This is cuckoo bananas stuff.
It's very out there.
And the conservative media space has been fighting over these nutty theories for months now.
Yeah, and listening to that cut again, Libby, I'm reminded of the last time Joe Kent came on KUOW. You were interviewing him for Soundside. It was the summer of 2024. He was running for Congress. And someone had just tried to shoot Trump at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And Kent was on Twitter spreading conspiracy theories about the Secret Service, how the agency had denied extra security for Trump and casting doubt on the investigation into the shooting. And you tried to press him on his lack of evidence. And he kept saying, hey, I don't know that anything nefarious was going on. I just want a full investigation. And he's doing that again here, only this time he's casting doubt on the FBI, which is an agency that he said should have been defunded after they raided Mar-a-Lago Mar-a-Lago during an investigation into Trump's handling of classified documents in 2022. And it's wild to think that someone with this kind of antipathy to government intelligence agencies was appointed to coordinate terrorism strategies among these agencies.
Well, and part of the reason many of these people are here is because many of these people ended up in the Trump administration is because they were critics of the very agencies that they were, like Kash Patel, similarly heading the FBI, was a big critic of the FBI.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of part of the selling point. I just think that it's important we set the baseline of the ways that Joe Kent veers into this fantasy land when he talks about January 6th, Charlie Kirk, et cetera. But there are things that Kent said in this Tucker Carlson interview that are based on what he says is firsthand knowledge. So not like speculation of, hey, I'm just asking questions, but actually stuff that he says he knew firsthand in his job with the Trump administration. So I'm going to make that turn now.
Yeah, let's get into those.
Yeah, let's talk about these specific claims. So first of all, Joe Kent, talked about U.S. intelligence on Iran's level of threat to the United States. He says Iran was not an imminent threat. There was no intelligence indicating they were, and that there was no intelligence indicating that Iran was trying to produce a nuclear weapon or on the cusp of doing so. So that's one issue. Kent also talked about the information that Trump was being presented in the lead up to war and who was allowed to talk to the president. Kent claims that in that period, only a small circle of advisors was allowed in to make the case to Trump. And he claimed that there was no robust debate. Some of the people who were allowed to talk to Trump, though, were Israeli intelligence officials, Benjamin Netanyahu. They had direct lines to Trump to present their case for war. And much of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, according to Joe Kent, was sidelined.
I think the circle that was around him was very, very tight and very small, and I think they were all on the same sheet of music.
Okay, and finally, the other point that Joe Kent says he has firsthand knowledge of is that U.S. intelligence was clear that Iran would shut down the Strait of Hormuz if it was attacked. That the Strait of Hormuz was a clear move for Iran to make any attack on its homeland painful for the rest of the world and painful for the United States. Now, this is something Trump himself has said no one expected just a few days ago. But Joe Kent says, no, everybody knew, and this was a clear intelligence assessment that the Strait of Hormuz would be targeted. So those are the significant claims that Kent made in this Tucker Carlson interview that he would, in his job, we assume, would have some firsthand knowledge about.
Yeah. So I want to touch on something, too, that I was thinking about when you mentioned much of the intelligence apparatus being sidelined. That included Joe Kent. He said in this interview that he was basically out of the loop and that he was not included in he didn't have the president's ear. He didn't receive whatever intelligence the president was getting about Iran. He wasn't seeing that. He was seeing the opposite. This is a big difference from when this distance between him and Trump. This is a big difference from when Kent was running as a MAGA candidate for Congress. It seemed like he would have been closer to the president than this. Back in 2022, I remember this. He appeared at an event in Mar-a-Lago, and Trump stood next to him, next to this clear podium, and he called Kent a very special person. But then this week, Trump told reporters that he didn't even know Joe Kent very well, and that he was weak on national security. And we've heard other administration officials say, too, that Kent had been cut out of intelligence briefings months ago, and now Kent himself confirmed that on Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, and that's what we're hearing, too, about Kent's boss, Tulsi Gabbard, by the way, the DNI director of national intelligence.
So given this distance between Kent and the president, it was also kind of surprising to me that Kent didn't try to burn a bridge during this Tucker Carlson interview. In fact, Kent praised Trump several times.
This was the other really striking thing about this Tucker Carlson interview with Joe Kent. He went out of his way, Kent did, to praise President Trump.
Right.
He said he loved the way Trump handled the 12-day war last June, targeting the nuclear sites. He approved of killing Qasem Soleimani in 2020, who was responsible for a lot of the proxy warfare around the region, Iranian general. And Kent was a huge booster of Trump in general as a strategic thinker. He was saying that President Trump is very smart. President Trump is brilliant at reading big data sets. There was so much praise for the president, who again, started an open-ended war in the Middle East, which has destabilized the region, driven up oil prices, cost American service member lives, let alone the people in Iran and in other countries who are being killed, Lebanon, etc. But for Joe Kent, the blame for this does not lie with Trump. It lies entirely with the distortions that Israeli intelligence allegedly fed to Trump, that he was manipulated into this war, and these close advisors who had his ear were also to blame.
The Israelis couldn't do any of this without us. And that's where the relationship is just way off kilter. If they have different objectives than us, then what are we doing letting them drive the war?
There's just some extreme acrobatics required to have Joe Kent be able to both proclaim his loyalty to the president, talk about how insightful and amazing the president is, but also to say the president has been fooled. You know, it's kind of mind-boggling to try to square that circle. It's clear, though, that he does hope to still sway President Trump. And by, doing this interview with Tucker Carlson, who in the past has had Trump's ear, and frankly, using the tool that is the most tried and true way to reach Trump in the past, then that's flattery.
But Libby, can we talk about why Joe Kent says he decided to go out on this limb?
Yeah.
So I was really moved when Kent went into detail about his personal reasons for speaking up about the war in Iran. Kent, like we mentioned, he's a decorated officer of the Special Forces, and he spent 5 years fighting in Iraq. And he told Tucker Carlson that while he was in Iraq, it began to dawn on him how much misinformation had played a part in starting that war and how he regretted the U.S. getting involved in that. He said it was a mistake and he didn't want to see the U.S. make that kind of a mistake again. And it was that experience, he said, that pushed him to make this major break with the White House.
I truly believe that God put me where I am right now, really putting me through everything I've been through in my life to bring me to this point. I don't believe that God said, "Hey, you're here now in this moment to just sit back and be a good soldier for this iteration."
This iteration of war in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think that Joe Kent is this incredibly fascinating and imperfect vessel for criticism of this war because he has spent so much time deployed.
Yeah.
He's returned with this distaste for the reasons that were sold to the American public for the Iraq War and what happened afterwards. He's lost more than most Americans can possibly imagine in the conflict in the Middle East with his wife. And since leaving military service, he has been this loyal foot soldier in the MAGA army. He is also somebody who has had to explain ties to white supremacists, and he is clearly echoing anti-Semitic tropes in many of these wilder conspiracy claims. That is putting Democrats in this odd bind of trying to pick and choose how seriously to take Joe Kent. And Trump, has to disavow a guy who he himself hired, the president hired to lead the National Counterterrorism Center as not strong on security, which also doesn't make any sense.
And I think Kent is also trying to reach out to MAGA by going on Tucker Carlson. He knows this is a space that many MAGA power players pay attention to. It's a huge show. The president pays attention to Tucker Carlson. And if Joe Kent has been out of the loop recently and can't get the president's attention, he probably hasn't now.
Before we go, there's a lot of headlines out there about, does this indicate a break in the MAGA coalition? And there's no doubt that influencers have a lot of sway with at least this White House and with many parts of, the Republican voting base. But polling shows that Republicans are on board with this war. I mean, PBS Marist polling suggests 8 in 10 Republicans still support the war in Iran.
That's big.
It's big. And I think that the polling changes when you look at, hey, do they support the idea of troops on the ground? It also, that's very unpopular among Republicans even. The idea of this going, dragging out is unpopular among Republicans. So there are lines that, show up in the polling. But the polling before we went to war in Iran also showed that Republicans didn't want to see that. But once Trump made the call, the polling changed to support it.
Joe Kent represents a fringe.
Yes, Joe Kent represents
fringe
a
opinion.
Fringe opinion. Tucker Carlson represents a fringe opinion among Republicans. And Cap, by the way, we have been talking about a lot of what may seem like palace intrigue here, in terms of who's in, who's out, who has the president's ear. But this does have real stakes. Earlier this month, 6 U.S. service members died in a crash of a refueling tanker in Iraq, and one was a 31-year-old from Covington, Washington. More than 1,200 Iranian civilians have died in strikes by the U.S. and Israel. There are strikes happening, across the Gulf region now, and just a lot of uncertainty and instability and loss of life going on. And
our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said this morning that there is no timeline for ending this war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at.
That's where we're at.
And that's Sound Politics for today.
I'm the editor, Cat Smith, and I'm sitting in for Scott Greenstone. Our producer is Gabrielle Healy.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. This show is only possible because of your support. Please consider a donation at KUOW.org/politics. And thanks for listening, everybody.